Hi everyone, and welcome to our second to last lecture of this unit. We will be covering the skeletal system. Now, we'll be working on this in lab, but lab and lecture are a little bit different when we start talking about bones. In lab, we're going to be working, as you've seen, with the actual bones, learning bones, their landmarks, and how to identify them in different configurations. But in lecture, since we're spending so much time in lab looking at the actual bones, we're not actually going to be learning about them in lecture. Instead, we're going to be focused more on physiology of the skeletal system. So looking at bone tissue, how it's made up, the different types of bone tissue, focusing on long bones and how they grow, and then we'll add in some fun stuff talking about the life of a bone and fractures. So let's get started. In this first video, we're going to primarily talk about the different types of osseous tissue and look at a lot of the structure. And then in our next video, we'll talk more about the physiology of how bones are forming and developing, and then talk about fractures. Now, the skeletal system, you can probably guess a couple of its major functions, right? Support is a big one. Our skeleton is basically the framework of our body, so it keeps everything upright and supported. Otherwise, it would just kind of be a pile of flesh. We also have protection, so you want to think your skull, your rib cage, those all afford protection to the delicate organs that lie in them, like the brain and the heart. What we don't typically think about are these last four. So storage of materials, assistance in movement, and blood cell production. Typically when we think about movement, what we're thinking of is the skeletal muscle. But as we'll see in our next unit, skeletal muscles can't do their job if they don't have something to pull on. And that thing that they're pulling on is the bones that you have in your arms, your legs, your face, your torso. So without these bones, our muscles wouldn't be able to do the work to provide movement. We also use our bones, as many of us know, to store calcium, but we also store phosphorus, which is an important molecule for our body, and we also store fat. So triglycerides are a type of lipid or fat, and they're actually stored on the inside of many of our long bones in what's called yellow bone marrow, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the structure of a long bone. Finally, something that most people aren't aware of, and I know when I first took my anatomy course way back in the day, this is a surprise to me as well, that your skeletal system is actually involved in blood cell production. Your body actually, when it needs to make more, say, red blood cells, it actually gets triggered for that from the kidneys, and then the kidneys release a hormone that tells your bone marrow, I should say, to produce more red blood cells. So it's kind of interesting how we have like different systems that are working together to create red blood cells. Now, red bone marrow is found at the ends of our long bones and in what we call flat bones as well. And its job is not just to produce red blood cells, but it's also to produce all blood cells essentially. So the word that we use for that is hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis, and that root word here, oops, let me redo that. That root word, hemato or hemo, this means blood. And we'll talk more about that in our second unit when we actually go through the process of blood formation. So all of these are different things that our skeletal system actually does. Now, in terms of bones, we have lots of different bones. Many of you could probably name several of them right now, right? Femur, your skull is not really a bone. It's made up of many, many bones. Many of you probably could name your tibia or your patella. Those are specific bones. And each of the roughly 206 bones in our body could be categorized, like we always do in anatomy, into these different categories of bones based off of their shape. So the first one we want to look at is a long bone. That would be this guy up here. This is a femur. Okay, it's a right femur. And it's considered a long bone because it is longer than it is wide. And we'll actually be spending a lot of time talking about long bones. Pretty much almost all the bones in your arms and in your legs are going to be long bones. The ones that are not long bones in your arms and legs are found in your wrist and ankles, and they're called short bones because they're about as wide as they are tall. So these would be things like the carpals of your wrist and the tarsals of your ankle. So everything else in your arms and legs basically are going to be long bones. Now the other one we have is a flat bone, as you can kind of see right here behind my video. Flat bones are actually made of the two types of bone tissue. We have compact and we have spongy, and spongy is in the center there, so it's like a little sandwich. These are going to include things like the cranial bones, your sternum, which is also called your breastbone, your ribs, your scapulae. These are all considered very flat bones. They're thin and they basically are just a sandwich of spongy bone. We also have irregular bones. These are bones like our sphenoid here that don't belong really in any other category. They look really weird. They're not long, they're not short, they're not growing out of a tendon. They're very weird looking bones. So examples of these are a lot of our facial bones, like the sphenoid, which is a cranial bone, your hip bones, the vertebrae, your heel, which is your calcaneus. They're all weird looking. So they're considered irregular bones. Now, a sesamoid bone, we actually have several of these in the body. These are bones that actually are growing inside of the tendon, more or less. And their job is to protect those tendons from wear and tear. The largest and most prominent sesamoid bone we have is our patella, which is your kneecap. But we also have some in our hands and in our feet. We just can't really see them because they're quite small. And as you will learn in lab, the smaller bones typically are the first ones to break or get lost in lab. Now finally, and it's kind of, sometimes they talk about the sutural bones, sometimes they don't, but sutural bones are going to be our sixth category, and they're kind of, I waver when I want to talk about them or not. But when you look at how the cranium is put together, which we will in lab, and we'll talk more about in chapter 9, the lines where you see the cranial bones come together, they're these jagged lines, and they're called sutural bone, or sutures. And sometimes we have little bones that are inside those sutures that just help join the cranial bones better. They're not their own bone, they're just these little tiny bones that kind of help make everything come together, which is why I don't often talk about them. These first 5, though, we will be looking at in lab because they're the easiest to find. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to kind of focus more on long bone anatomy, and the long bone is divided into 3 regions. So the shaft of the bone, this is going to be called our diaphysis. The ends of a long bone, where it's going to meet up with another bone, this is called an epiphysis. So this is a humerus. So this proximal epiphysis would meet up with our scapula to form our shoulder joint, and the distal epiphysis would meet up with our radius and ulna to form the elbow joint. And where the diaphysis and epiphyses meet, this is called the metaphysis. Now, inside the epiphyses, and we will talk a little bit more about these later, there is a pad of cartilage inside of our epiphysis. And that pad of cartilage is what's going to help our long bone grow. And we call this pad of cartilage an epiphyseal plate. When we hit the point in our development where we're no longer going to be growing in height, that cartilage has basically gone away, and now we see a line because there's no more cartilage, so it shows up a little bit differently on an x-ray, and we call that an epiphyseal line. So if you're still growing, we would see the plate, and if you've stopped growing, we would see the line. So we'll talk more about those a little bit later. Now the epiphyses, remember, these are where we're going to be connecting to other bones. And one important thing about joints that we'll talk about when we get to our joint chapter is that we don't want friction. We don't want bones rubbing against each other. So one way to prevent that is by covering the ends of the long bones with a, fairly frictionless tissue, which is hyaline cartilage. This hyaline cartilage, because it's on the outside of the bone where we articulate or join up with another bone, this is called articular cartilage. So the ends of the long bones are covered with hyaline cartilage to help reduce the friction at those joints. When this cartilage gets worn down or inflamed, that's where you can have joint problems like osteoarthritis. Now, if we look at the diaphysis here, you will notice that your long bones are hollow, okay? There is a hollow cavity in here that is called the medullary cavity. And that medullary cavity is where we're going to find our yellow bone marrow, which, if you recall from previous slides, this is going to be fat. So those of you that may have gone to a fancy restaurant and had bone marrow, what you're eating is fat. So that's why they call it meat butter, and they serve it with bread. So it's just the inside of a cow. Typically, it's their bone marrow. And it's very, very unctuous and fatty because it's just fat stores. So yellow bone marrow. Now here are two x-rays. If we think about, we're going to talk about those epiphyseal plates and epiphyseal lines. So on the left, we can see this is our knee joint. You can see that it almost looks like these bones, the tibia, the fibula, and the femur, it looks like they're fractured. They are not fractures. These are just the epiphyseal plates or the growth plates. Because cartilage has a different density than bone, it shows up not as opaque as bone. So we can see that it's this person is still growing. On the right, I do not see that. In fact, I can barely even see the epiphyseal line. This to me would indicate that this person has stopped growing. Why is this important? Well, it's important for things like forensic anthropology. If we find bones and we have nothing else to go on, besides using amazing techniques to figure out height and age and even ethnicity and gender with just bones, we can x-ray them and see, oh, this person, they still have a growth plate and they have this much of it. They're probably in this age range based off of the size of the bone and the growth plate that we can find. Or we don't see a growth plate, likely they are of this age range. So it's kind of fun. We'll actually talk a little bit more about the growth plate later when we discuss how our bones grow. So we'll kind of look at that in a little bit more detail later on. Okay, so we've looked at sort of the structure of a long bone, looked at the inside. Now I want to look at the layers, the membranes that we find on a bone. Now in lab, we don't see these membranes because our bones are dead. They are no longer living. And or they might be fabricated plastic. So they are not going to have these membranes. It's only found in living bones. So when you eat like a chicken bone and you feel that slippery texture on the outside of the bone, that's the periosteum. That's the membrane on the outside. And that periosteum, which you can see here peeled back, it acts like a attachment site. So it's like glue that the tendons of our muscles will attach to. And it attaches itself to the diaphysis through these little fibers here called our perforating fibers. And the membrane actually is pretty fibrous on the outside because we want to have a really good attachment site. And on the inner layer, where it's in contact with bone, it has what we call an osteogenic layer. So osteo, while we're in the topic of bone, osteo, this refers to bone or the skeletal system. And genic is what's referring to like creation, like a genesis. So it's bone creation. And once again, we will talk more about that later. Now, lining the inside of our long bones in the diaphysis here, lining that medullary cavity is the endosteum. And we use the endosteum as well as the periosteum for things like widening our bone. Now, before we can get into the other aspects of bone, like the different types of bone tissue, we need to look at bone under the microscope. Now, in our first lab unit, we did take a look at bone, compact, and I might have had some spongy bone out for you to look at as well. But we didn't really talk about what cells were there or what the structures were. And that's what we're leading into right now. Now, bone, remember, is a connective tissue. It's a specialized connective tissue because it has special cells, special structure, and its matrix is calcified. The extracellular matrix contains collagen, which, remember, is very strong but has some flexibility to it. We have water because it is an extracellular matrix. And it's mostly a lot of mineral salts, so the calcium and phosphorus salts that have been deposited that help make the bone hard. Now, one thing I want to talk about right now are two definitions that are very, very easy to confuse with one another. Calcification and ossification. Calcification can occur anywhere in the body. What it means is we have deposited calcium on a tissue, and that tissue gets hard. So you can have a calcified aortic valve. You can have calcifications in breast tissue. All it means is minerals have deposited in a place that they should not be depositing, and the tissue gets hard. Ossification is different. Ossification is where we get calcification. We start laying down these mineral salts, but the extracellular matrix of that tissue gets hard. So it's not the tissue itself. It's not like the valve tissue or the breast tissue getting hard. It's actually the extracellular matrix. So they're two different things. Calcification is just the deposition of minerals. Ossification is taking it a step further and hardening an extracellular matrix. So I just want to make sure that we're very clear on the definitions of those two processes. Now, when it comes to bone formation, bone existence, we have a lot of different cells involved. Now, these first three here are basically stem cells, the osteoblasts, and the osteocytes. These are all one cell lineage. The osteoclasts all come from their own lineage. Now, when I say lineage, that's a term that we use in cellular biology and biology in general to denote a sort of a family tree sort of line, like where did this cell come from? So osteogenic, remember this means bone forming. Another name we have is an osteoprogenitor cell. These are stem cells. So these are the ones that are going to be producing our osteoblasts. So blast is going to create. These are the guys that are going to initiate that calcification and start to lay down all of that mineral salts that will then lead to the process of ossification. So they essentially start the creation of bone. As this happens, which we'll see in our next video, as this happens, the cell itself basically builds a wall of this hardened matrix around itself, and it morphs, it matures into an osteocyte. Remember, site means cell. So the osteocytes, which you can see here, they're kind of encased in this bone, and their job is to perform metabolism. They're what keeps the bone alive. Nutrient and waste metabolism is what's happening with those cells. So what do osteoclasts do? Well, osteoclasts, first and foremost, they're derived from white blood cells. And what they do is they break down bone. Now, why would we want to break down bone? Well, as we'll see when we talk about the endocrine system, keeping our calcium levels in homeostasis is a very delicate balance. So when we have too much calcium, we use osteoblasts to lay down that calcium on our bone. And when we have too little calcium, we can actually use these osteoclasts who have enzymes inside their cells that can sort of dissolve away a little bit of the bone and release that calcium. Now, if we look at these cells, we can see here, once again, these are all one cell lineage. And this is from a different sort of family, I guess you would say. So we have the stem cells that are going to turn into our osteoblasts that are going to form that extracellular matrix, and they eventually turn into the osteocyte, which just kind of keeps your bone alive. And then we have our osteoclasts who are going to break down the bone when we need to. And the way to remember that is when you look at them, they look like scrubbing bubbles. And what scrubbing bubbles cleaning brand does is it breaks down like grease and grime. So the osteoclasts are going to break down the bone. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about bone tissue in general, we can start looking at the specific types of bone. So we have compact and spongy, and we already know this from our previous lab unit. Compact bone is, as it sounds, very compact, dense bone tissue. Its job is to basically protect. It reduces stress that's been created whenever we move or by the weight that we put on our bones. The problem with compact bone is that it is very heavy. So if we think about our diaphysis, remember how it was hollow in the center? The diaphysis is made of compact bone. So if we want to talk about where we find compact bone, it's in the diaphysis of a long bone. But long bones are hollow because if that whole shaft were made of very dense compact bone, it would be incredibly difficult for us to even move those bones. It'd be too heavy for our muscles to really get good leverage behind there. So they're hollow. Now, when we look at compact bone under the microscope, like you guys did during the second week of lab, you will see these repeating circular patterns, and we call these osteons. These are sort of the functional or structural unit of bone. They are concentric circles or layers of bone that orbit, essentially, or encircle a hollow area where we would have blood vessels and nerves and lymph vessels running through. So each one of these canals here is the center of an individual osteon, which is the unit of compact bone. So I want to go through these structures with you, kind of define them, and then we'll take a look at the image. Now, the central canal, as we saw on that previous slide, this is the center of the osteon. Okay, and as I mentioned, this is where we're going to have our blood vessels, lymph vessels, nerves are all going to be running through there. The osteon is running the length of the bone. So there are all these like cylinders that are running the length of the bone. So the Haversian canals are going to go up and down with the bone. The perforating or Volkmann's canals are going to go perpendicular. So if this is the diaphysis of my bone, what happens is the perforating canals are going to run this way. So let me just give that a red color. And then the, it erased. So the perforating canals are going to run this way, and then the central canals will run this way. Think of the perforating canals as getting the blood vessels in, and then the central canals are what disseminate it and down the bone. The term Haversian and Volkmann's, that's just the name of the gentleman that discovered these particular structures in bone. I prefer central and perforating because they kind of give you a little bit more information about what's going on instead of just someone's name. But I learned them by the name. If that's how you want to learn it, that's fine too. Now, in terms of the circles that are going around the bone, or excuse me, around the central canal here, they are layers, and we call layers lamellae, or a lamella for short for singular. Concentric lamellae are the ones that are going around the Haversian canal. They're like orbits around the sun, concentric circles, okay? Circumferential lamellae, they're going to go around the circumference of the bone. So they're going to go around the outside of the bone. Whereas, once again, your concentric lamellae are going around the Haversian canal. Okay, so circumferential, like a circumference, concentric is like in orbit. Now, lacunae and canaliculi, these are structures that are associated outside of the osteocyte. So here's a little osteocyte. They look kind of funky. Okay. Now, surrounding the osteocyte is its empty space that we call the lacuna, just like in our cartilage. So that would be a lacuna. And one thing about bone, and I'll show it to you a little bit easier on the next slide, unlike connective tissue, other connective tissues where the nutrients and waste can just diffuse through the matrix, bone has a solid matrix, so it can't have diffusion. Nothing can really penetrate and go through the bone without there being a channel there. How bone gets around this is going from each of these little central canals are little tiny channels that meet up with the osteocytes. And we call these little channels canaliculi, literally meaning little canal. So that is how we're able to get nutrients and waste from cells that are way out on the outside of, or further away, I should say, from the central canal. We can use these little canaliculi. So here we have a little wedge of bone. Okay, we're looking at the compact bone in the diaphysis. Here we have those lamellae that are running along the outside, the circumferential lamellae. Here's a whole osteon right here with its concentric lamellae. We have our central canal, which runs up and down with all of its vessels. And then we have our perforating canals, which are going to have the perpendicular look. So they're going to go perforate the bone here. And then if we look closer, we zoom in on one of these little areas here, you can see here's our osteocyte in the lacuna, and then here are these little channels. They look like fractures, but these little tiny canals are how we're going to be moving nutrients and waste from the blood vessels and the osteocytes back and forth. So this would be a really good example of the osteon and the compact bone in general. And this is something you guys are going to be working with in lab with that model that we have. Now, spongy or cancellous bone is the second type of bone tissue we have, and it's called spongy because, as you can see, it looks like a sponge. Now, in living bone, these cavities would not be empty. They would be full of red bone marrow, okay? And one common misconception about spongy bone is that because it has all these holes, it's so porous, it's very, it's easy to fracture, it's very weak. That is not actually true. Spongy bone has all of these little irregular columns that are creating this porous look, and they call them trabeculae. Okay, so these trabeculae, these irregular columns of bone, are built along your stress lines. So the way you move your body, your weight, your gait, this is going to affect how the trabeculae form in your spongy bone. So they actually do afford quite a bit of strength to the bones. We tend to find a lot of spongy bone in a couple of different places. So you're going to find them in flat bones and irregular bones because they're kind of these spongy bone sandwiches. And you also remember we're going to find them in the ends of long bones. So the ends of a long bone are going to be made of spongy bone, and the diaphysis, the shaft of the long bone, is made of compact bone. Okay, that is where we're going to find spongy bone. One important fact about spongy bone is there are no osteons. So we don't actually see those repeating patterns of circles around a central canal in spongy bone. We do have osteocytes, they do bring blood in, we do have lacunae, but there is no repeating circular pattern when you look at spongy bone. Now, while we're on the topic of spongy bone, I want to talk a little bit about osteoporosis. So osteoporosis, many of you have probably heard of. You may know someone that has it. You yourself may be diagnosed with this. So it's osteoporosis. So once again, osteo is bone. Porosis, it sounds like porous. Did not spell that right. P-O-R-O-U-S. So it means the bone is getting more and more holy. Now when we look at normal spongy bone, here are those trabeculae, those irregular columns of bone, and we have circles, we have lamellae, but these are not osteons because there's no central canal. It's just like layers of bone. Now, when we look at how they're built in a normal bone, we can see that they're porous, but there's not these huge big spaces, and the trabeculae look fairly robust. In someone that has osteoporosis, you can see how those pores become much larger and the trabeculae have become much more weak. They look thinner and more fragile. Now, those that tend to get osteoporosis are women that are postmenopausal. And the reason women tend to get osteoporosis more than men is because our hormones are tied to our bone strength. When you go through menopause, your estrogen levels drop, and we actually need estrogen to absorb calcium in our diet. And if you don't make sure that you are taking a calcium supplement or making sure you're getting enough calcium, your body is going to leach it from your bones. And that's where you can get osteoporosis. It starts out usually as what's called osteopenia, which means softening. Penia means softening of the bone, and then it can progress into osteoporosis. Typically, one of the ways you can prevent this is just with strength training. As we'll see in our next video when we do talk about what's called bone remodeling, when your bones encounter a stressor, they're going to react to it. So if you start working out and lifting weights, you're tugging on those attachment sites on bone, and it realizes it needs to be stronger. So it's going to start to lay down more bone in that area to make the bone stronger to withstand that stress. So that's just one of the ways it can be treated. Now, the last thing we want to talk about today in this chapter is the bone, or the blood and nerve supply of the bone. Bone is bloody. Any of you that have ever broken a bone know that, or seen a broken bone are aware of this. One of the first signs that you know you've broken a bone, besides intense pain, is a very, very large bruise. This is actually really good because that means that bone will heal a lot faster. Remember, the more blood we have in an area, the faster it's going to heal, because we're going to get all of those healing elements to the area. Now, bone has a lot of blood vessels. As you can see, we have vessels that run through the medullary cavity, okay, that enter through what's called the nutrient foramen. So in lab, I always ask my students, get one of the real femurs, see if you can find that nutrient foramen. It's a little hole in the middle of the diaphysis, and I always say get a femur because it's the largest bone in the body, so you have a better chance of finding it. So the blood vessels come in through the nutrient artery and artery, they spread through the diaphysis down to the metaphysis and epiphyses. And the nice thing about the vessels is they're named off of where they're found. We have epiphyseal vessels and we have metaphyseal vessels. So they're going to supply those regions of the bone. We are also going to have vessels that are going to run along the outside of the bone, which we kind of saw when we were looking at the periosteum slide. We have blood vessels that are going to run around the periosteum to supply nutrients to that area. Now, in terms of nerve supply, we do have nerve supply in the bone. Once again, any of you that have ever broken a bone before are aware that they hurt. So the periosteum is actually the part where we're going to have all the bone nerves. So the nerves are primarily going to be, the sensory nerves are going to be primarily here in the periosteum. They're going to run along the outer periosteal vessels. So when you rupture the periosteum, you rupture the nerves or irritate them, and that's what leads to the pain that you get when you break a bone. So that's it for this video. In the next video, to sort of tie up this chapter, we're going to talk about how we form bone, how we grow it, how it's remodeled, and what happens when we fracture it. So we're going to kind of go through the life cycle of bone. So see you then.